My name is Emily Carter. I am 36 years old, and at my sister's wedding, I was not seated with my family, but shoved to the back with the servants given nothing but a dry piece of bread. The laughter, the stares, the shame burned hotter than any wound I had ever carried. But what none of them expected was that by the end of the night, I would rise and do something that left the entire ballroom silent. I walked into the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston, with my daughter Lily at my side, her small hand gripping mine as tightly as if she feared being left behind. The chandeliers sparkled above us, casting light over rows of tables dressed in white linen. Guests in gowns and tuxedos moved gracefully through the lobby, their laughter floating like music. Lily looked around with wide eyes, whispering that it felt like a castle. I smiled for her sake, though my chest already tightened. I moved toward the seating chart framed in gold near the entrance of the ballroom. Names were written in elegant script. I scanned each list carefully, searching once, then twice. But my name never appeared. My parents were seated near the front with Rachel's in-laws. Rachel herself, of course, sat at the center, beside her groom, glowing under the lights. Even distant relatives had their spots, yet mine was nowhere. My throat grew dry. Lily tugged at my arm, asking where we should go. Before I could answer, the wedding planner appeared, her smile practiced. She guided us through the rows of glittering tables, past servers pouring champagne and trays of lamb and seafood, until we reached the far end beside a swinging kitchen door. The tablecloth was wrinkled, the silverware mismatched. Two servers quickly rose when we approached, embarrassed to find us seated among them. At my place setting lay a single piece of bread, dry and unbuttered. I stared at it, heat crawling up my neck. Lily climbed into the chair beside me, her brow furrowed. She whispered, asking why we had no food like the others. I told her quietly that it was fine, but inside my chest burned. Laughter echoed from the other tables. Guests raised glasses, their plates filled with dishes chosen from a menu I had never been offered. I caught a few eyes sliding toward us, then away as if confirming a rumor. The sound of a phone clicking reached me, and when I looked up, I saw a woman at the next table tilt her screen toward me, capturing the image of me and my daughter at the servants' table, with nothing but bread in front of us. She leaned toward her companion, whispering with a smirk. Lily shifted uncomfortably, pressing against me. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, steadying her. My pulse hammered in my ears, the humiliation sharp as glass. I forced myself to sit tall, though I wanted nothing more than to disappear. The scent of roasted meat drifted from the kitchen doors beside us, mocking in its closeness. Then, as I lifted my eyes toward the front, I saw Eleanor, my mother, glance over her shoulder. She adjusted her pearl necklace with a cold smile that never touched her eyes. A moment later, Rachel appeared at the head of the aisle, her dress glittering under the lights. For an instant, our eyes met. Her lips curved not into joy, but into something sharper. It was not enough for her to shine. She needed me to fade. I lowered my gaze, holding Lily's hand tighter. The night had only just begun, and already the air carried the promise of something worse waiting to unfold. Rachel drifted past my table like a vision in lace, her train sweeping across the floor, the sparkle of her gown catching every light in the ballroom. She leaned close as if to bless me, her perfume heavy and sweet, and whispered that this was exactly where I belonged. Her smile glimmered for the crowd, but her words were sharp enough to slice my skin. I froze, feeling my breath catch, while Lily squeezed my hand tighter. Eleanor followed only a step behind, pearls shining against her throat. She paused long enough to let her eyes rake across me, and murmured that I had always been strong and needed less than others. Her voice was pitched just high enough for those nearby to hear, and the ripple of laughter that followed was more painful than the words themselves. I lowered my gaze, trying to steady the pounding in my chest, but Lily leaned against me, whispering what they meant. I had no answer for her. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy. I wished I could shield her ears from every syllable, but there was no escape. From the front of the room, the head table gleamed like a stage. Candles burned in crystal holders. Platters of beef tenderloin and seafood towers glistened under silver lids. Glasses of wine sparkled ruby and gold. I could hear bursts of laughter and clinking silverware, while at our table the only sound was the creak of the kitchen door, swinging open and shut, the scent of garlic and smoke spilling into the air. A woman in a sequined dress leaned across the table beside us. her eyes sharp with curiosity. She whispered to her companion, loud enough for me to hear, that it was pitiful that even my family did not want me at their side. Her friend snickered, covering her mouth too late. My cheeks burned as if branded. I wanted to rise, to shout, to tell them they knew nothing, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place. Lily tugged at me again, her small voice asking why people looked at us that way. I stroked her hair and told her softly not to worry, but my heart twisted at her innocence. She deserved joy and celebration, not whispers and cruel stares. The music swelled as the band began another song, drowning some of the murmurs, but not the sting left behind. Rachel turned her face back toward the room, radiant for the cameras, and I saw her lips curve in satisfaction as she glanced at me from afar. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. The bread on my plate stared back at me, dry and unyielding, as if mocking me. I forced myself to breathe, to sit tall, even as shame pressed like a weight on my shoulders. My mind churned with memories of every dismissal, every slight, every time I had been told to be quiet. Around me, conversations rose and fell, people leaning closer to exchange gossip. I felt their eyes on my back, their curiosity fed by Rachel's silent performance. The humiliation was no accident, and the realization stiffened my spine. Lily rested her head against my arm, trying to hide from the stares. I kissed the top of her hair, my voice steady, though my heart raced, promising that everything was fine. But I knew it was not. Something deeper than embarrassment pulsed beneath my skin, a current of anger I had kept buried for years. As the song ended and applause filled the room, I caught my mother's eyes again. Eleanor looked satisfied, as if she had secured her younger daughter's triumph by crushing me quietly in a corner. That look lodged itself inside me deeper than any words could. I sat still, my jaw clenched, the hum of the crowd roaring in my ears. The night was not over, and I could already feel the weight of old wounds pressing to the surface, waiting for their moment to be exposed. I remembered another night when the air had been just as heavy, the spring of 2010, when my grandmother passed away. Her small house in Somerville had always been my refuge, the place where I spent summers reading on the porch while she hummed old songs in the kitchen. After the funeral, the lawyer read her will, and I heard my name spoken clearly. The house was meant for me. It was not grand, but it was safety, a chance to start fresh with something that was finally mine. For a brief moment, I felt chosen, as though someone in this family believed I deserved more than scraps. Only weeks later, the papers disappeared. My mother called me into the dining room, the table polished and set, as if to distract from what she was about to do. Rachel sat there in a silk blouse, pretending to flip through magazines, her smile thin. My mother slid new documents across the table and told me to sign. She said the house needed to stay in Rachel's name, that it was better for everyone. I refused, my voice trembling but firm. She leaned closer, her tone sharp enough to leave marks, accusing me of being selfish, of threatening family harmony. Rachel watched, her eyes gleaming with victory, while I finally scrawled my name, my hand shaking so hard the ink smeared. That night I walked the streets of Somerville with the signed paper folded in my pocket. I stopped outside my grandmother's house, the windows dark, and knew I had just lost the only inheritance I would ever have. I pressed my forehead against the fence and promised myself I would never forgive them. The only thing I managed to keep was a faded photocopy of the original will that I had tucked into my bag before it vanished. I kept it hidden for years in a file box under my bed, proof that my grandmother had wanted me to have something of my own. The years after that were a blur of long shifts at the community health clinic in Roxbury, raising Lily on my own, with no help from anyone. I filled out school forms alone, worked double shifts to pay rent, cooked dinner on nights when my body felt ready to collapse. Rachel was rising in New York, flashing photos of rooftop parties and promotions in public relations. My parents applauded her every success, while I was the forgotten daughter, the strong one who supposedly needed nothing. Sitting at the wedding table now beside the swinging kitchen door, the memory came rushing back, as sharp as the night I lost that house. The laughter around me blurred, replaced by the sound of my mother's voice hissing not to be selfish. My fingers itched for the folder at home, where the photocopy still rested, its edges worn, but words unshaken. I imagined standing up right then, holding it high for every guest to see, proving that I had been wronged long before this night. Lily's voice pulled me back. She asked softly if we could go home after the cake. I stroked her hair, telling her soon, but inside I felt the walls of silence closing in. The humiliation of this wedding was only another link in a long chain, but I knew chains could be broken. My breath steadied as I looked again toward the glowing head table where Rachel smiled for cameras basking in her kingdom of lights. She thought I was powerless, but the truth was folded safely in my drawer, waiting. I could almost feel the paper in my hand, my grandmother's name written in firm strokes, her gift stolen, but not forgotten. And as I sat in the shadows of that ballroom, I realized the night might finally give me the chance to use it. The sound of glasses clinking echoed across the ballroom as Rachel's friends lifted their champagne in another toast. I sat still at my corner table, watching the glow of candles play across the polished wood, feeling the sting of being hidden away yet again. Then out of the bustle, a familiar voice brushed past my shoulder. Mark Johnson, my colleague from the health clinic, paused just long enough to murmur that if I needed a witness tonight, he would stand beside me. His eyes met mine for only a second, but there was a quiet resolve there that steadied me. Across the room, I caught sight of Karen Brooks, a longtime friend and pediatrician I trusted more than most. She was seated with her husband near the dance floor. When our eyes met, she gave me a slow nod. No words needed her expression, calm and strong. For the first time that night, I felt the faint stir of something other than shame. I was not completely alone. I adjusted the napkin in my lap, trying to slow the tremor in my hands when my phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit up with a message from Marissa, a college friend now living in New York. I opened it, and my stomach tightened. It was a video, grainy, but clear enough, showing Rachel in a crowded bar only a few months earlier. She was laughing, her hand sliding along the arm of a man who was not Tyler. The camera caught them leaning in mouths pressed together, oblivious to the people around them. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around quickly, tucking the phone closer so Lily would not see. The music swelled again, the band shifting to a jazz number, but I heard nothing except the pounding of my pulse. For years, Rachel had been untouchable, her charm and polish shielding her from consequence. Now in my hand was proof that her perfect image was cracked. I felt the corners of my mouth tighten, not into a smile, but into something steadier. In my mind, I saw two pieces coming together: the faded copy of my grandmother's will hidden at home, and this damning video glowing on my phone. Alone, they were painful reminders, but together they could shatter the illusion Rachel had built. Lily tugged at my sleeve, asking if we could leave soon. I bent down, brushing her hair back, and told her to hold on a little longer. My voice was soft, but inside me a storm was gathering. The humiliation of the bread and the whispers still clung to me, but underneath, fire had started to burn. At the head table, Rachel raised her glass once more, smiling so wide the photographers circled like moths to a flame. Her eyes flicked in my direction, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw a flash of unease, as if she sensed that I was no longer as powerless as she believed. I straightened in my chair, feeling the weight of the room pressing against me, but no longer crushing me. The bread lay untouched on my plate, stale and forgotten. While in my pocket, my phone vibrated again with another message from Marissa asking if I had seen it. I closed my hand around it, my decision hardening with every beat of my heart. The night was shifting. I could feel it. For years I had carried silence like armor, but silence had never protected me. Tonight I had allies and I had evidence. The only question was how long I would wait before letting the truth cut through the noise of the celebration. Warren Grant sat stiffly near the head table, his silver hair catching the light as he studied Rachel with narrowed eyes. His voice carried just enough for those closest to hear, telling Tyler that something about her family was not right. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as he glanced between his bride and his father. The words rippled across the front rows, and though music and laughter tried to drown them, I could feel the tension settle like smoke in the air. Eleanor noticed it too. Her posture stiffened, her smile fixed like porcelain as she excused herself from the table. She crossed the room with steady steps, her heels tapping sharply until she reached me. Without asking, she gripped my arm, pulling me toward a corner shadowed by tall floral arrangements. Her breath smelled faintly of wine as she hissed that I had better not make a scene. She warned me that if I stirred trouble, I would ruin everything Rachel had worked for. Her eyes were sharp, daring me to defy her, the same eyes that had cornered me so many times before. I wanted to pull away to tell her the truth was already heavy in my pocket, but my voice caught. Lily appeared at my side, her eyes glistening, her small hand clutching the hem of my dress. She whispered that she did not want to stay any longer. The words pierced deeper than anything Eleanor had said. My body went rigid, and for a moment, I could not breathe. I looked down at Lily, her lips trembling, her face pressed into my side to hide from the noise and the stares. Memories crowded in of nights when she had asked why her grandparents never came to her birthdays, why Rachel's name was always spoken with pride, while mine was a footnote. I had shielded her from the worst of it, swallowing my anger, pretending silence was strength. But here she was, feeling the sting herself, asking to leave a place where she should have been celebrated. I crouched and pulled her into my arms, pressing my cheek against her hair. I whispered that I was sorry, that I knew this was unfair. She shook her head, tears streaking down her cheeks, and told me she just wanted to go home. I held her tighter, my eyes burning, but no tears falling. Something inside me shifted. I could not keep telling her to endure. I could not let her believe that humiliation was our inheritance. I straightened, still holding Lily close, and looked back toward the glowing head table. Rachel laughed at something whispered in her ear, tilting her head back so her pearls caught the light. Eleanor returned to her seat, satisfied she had silenced me again. They had no idea that silence was no longer possible. My chest rose with a slow breath, my arms steady around my daughter. I told her softly that we would not be invisible anymore, that I promised her I would not stay quiet this time. Her eyes widened, searching mine, and I gave her the faintest nod. The decision was made. The applause that followed the next toast rang hollow in my ears. I was already planning, already feeling the weight of evidence pressing against me. The night was building toward something I could no longer hold back, and every second carried me closer to it. The master of ceremonies announced that it was time for guests to share a few words for the bride and groom. A murmur of anticipation rippled across the ballroom as champagne glasses clinked. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. Before I could second-guess myself, I rose from my chair. Chairs scraped and whispers spread as heads turned toward the back of the room, where I stood holding Lily's hand for courage. I released her gently, straightened my shoulders, and stepped forward. The noise dulled conversations fading, until only the band's soft hum filled the silence. My voice carried farther than I expected, steady despite the fire in my chest. I told them that if I was only worthy of a piece of bread, then perhaps they should also see what else I was worth. Gasps rose, and a few people shifted uncomfortably, the sting of truth cutting into the polished air. A technician hesitated when I held out a small flash drive, but after a pause he plugged it into the system. The screen behind the head table flickered, and then the words appeared. A scanned page filled the screen, my grandmother's will from 2010. The lawyer's signature was there, the lines crisp, and beneath it, my name meant to inherit her house in Somerville. Through the document ran a thick black mark, where my name had been crossed out, the ink jagged and sloppy. Murmurs swelled. Guests leaned forward, reading, whispering. Eleanor's face drained of color, her hand gripping the table until her knuckles whitened. Rachel's smile faltered, and for the first time that night, her eyes darted nervously across the room. The hush broke into sharp whispers. Someone asked if it was real. Another muttered that it explained so much. I could hear the disbelief rising, a tide that no toast could drown. Rachel began to stand, her mouth opening as if to protest, but the screen changed again before she could speak. The video played without sound, but the images were loud enough. Rachel sat in a crowded Manhattan bar, laughing, her hand sliding along the arm of a man who was clearly not her husband. Their faces drew close, and then they kissed the camera, capturing every detail. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, phones lifted to record the scandal as it played out in front of her new family. Tyler's face blanched, his jaw tight as he stared at the screen. Warren leaned forward, eyes blazing. The applause and laughter of moments ago were gone, replaced with chaos. Flashes burst as guests snapped photos, their whispers sharpening into judgment. Rachel's skin flushed crimson as she turned frantically, her perfect image unraveling under the weight of proof. Eleanor reached for her daughter's arm, trying to shield her, but the damage was done. I stood still in the center of it all, saying nothing more. My silence was louder than any words I could have spoken. The screen went black, leaving only the echoes of voices ricocheting through the hall. My heart pounded, my breath ragged, yet I felt lighter than I had in years. I had finally pulled truth into the light. The crowd's noise rose into a storm. Some guests demanded answers, others whispered in disgust. Tyler remained motionless, his face carved with betrayal. Rachel trembled, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if it could anchor her. Eleanor's eyes darted wildly, searching for control, but she found none. I lowered my gaze only once to see Lily watching me with wide eyes. Her small hand reached for mine, and when I held it, she squeezed with quiet strength. For the first time, I saw pride in her expression, not fear. The music had stopped, the band silent, every eye still on me. I knew this was only the beginning. The truths I had revealed would demand consequences, and the people I loved and feared most would not let me walk away unchallenged. Rachel lurched to her feet, her veil trembling as she shouted that it was only a misunderstanding. Her voice cracked against the walls of the ballroom, brittle and desperate. Eleanor pushed her chair back with a screech, rising to her daughter's defense. She pointed at me, her face red with fury, and declared that I had always been jealous, that I had plotted against Rachel for years. Their words collided in the air, frantic and hollow, but they could not cover what had already been seen. Karen Brooks moved forward from her table, her calm presence cutting through the noise. She spoke clearly, that she had witnessed how I had been humiliated that night, that the cruelty began long before the video played. Guests fell into silence, heads turning as her authority rang out. Mark Johnson stood beside her, his voice steady as he confirmed that nothing I revealed was fabricated. The tide of whispers shifted, doubt giving way to something heavier. Tyler remained frozen at the head table, his hands clenched against the white linen, his eyes fixed on the screen that had gone black. His father Warren stood abruptly, his chair toppling behind him. Without a word, he strode toward the doors, his anger visible in the hard set of his shoulders. The murmurs swelled again like a wave crashing across the hall. I stood still, my hands trembling at my sides until I felt warmth close over them. David rose from his seat, his movements measured, his face steady. He took my hand in his and turned to the crowd. His voice carried with a strength that silenced the hall. He said no one had the right to humiliate me, not for bread, not for silence, not for anything. If a piece of bread was enough to strip dignity, then he would share that indignity with me. The words cut deeper than all the accusations. The room hushed, breath held, as his declaration settled over the guests. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a single clap rang out, followed by another, until the sound swelled into a wave of applause. Some guests rose to their feet, others nodded with tears shining in their eyes. The atmosphere shifted, the judgment that had hung on my shoulders, sliding away, pressing back toward Rachel and Eleanor. Rachel's face twisted, her hands clutching her gown. She cried out that I had ruined her day, that I had always been determined to steal the spotlight. Her voice broke into sobs, raw and uncontrollable. Eleanor tried to hold her upright, whispering frantically, but the weight of the room was no longer theirs to command. I squeezed David's hand, the steadiness of his grip grounding me as my body threatened to collapse from the release of it all. I glanced down to see Lily, her eyes wide, tears on her cheeks, but her mouth curved into a small, proud smile. For the first time, she was not hiding. She was standing tall beside us. The applause faded into a heavy silence, every eye still locked on the wreckage unfolding at the head table. Rachel's sobs filled the space, brittle and sharp, echoing through the glittering hall that no longer belonged to her. I knew this was not the end. The collapse of her perfect facade was only the beginning of what would come next, and the consequences would reach further than this night. By the time the last guests filed out of the ballroom, the celebration had collapsed into whispers and cold stares. Rachel sat slumped in her chair. Her makeup streaked her sobs, muffled by Eleanor's frantic attempts to soothe her. Tyler no longer looked at his bride, his face pale as stone. Warren had vanished hours earlier, his disapproval ringing louder than words. Cameras had caught every second, and I knew by morning the story would spread far beyond the walls of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. News traveled fast in Boston. Within days, Rachel's company in New York issued a statement that she was on indefinite leave. Her polished image, once celebrated on social media and in glossy press releases, was tainted by the scandal. Invitations that had once filled her inbox went silent. Eleanor and Charles stayed behind closed doors, their phones unanswered. For the first time in my life, their silence was not a weapon against me, but a shield they built for themselves as the world turned its eyes on them with judgment. I replayed the night over and over, each detail sharp, each choice irreversible. There had been no joy in exposing her only necessity, yet for the first time I felt lightness where shame had lived for years. The burden was no longer mine to carry. In a quiet room upstairs after the chaos, Lily climbed into my lap. Her small arms wrapped around my neck, her cheek pressed to mine. She whispered that I had made her proud. I held her tighter, my chest breaking open with relief. For so long, I had feared she would grow up believing humiliation was her fate, but now she had seen that dignity could be defended. The city lights glowed beyond the tall windows. Boston's streets stretched out beneath me, headlights weaving through the night, voices drifting faintly from outside. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the coolness, and let myself breathe. Justice was slow. It had taken years of silence and hurt, but it had finally spoken. My grandmother's voice lived in the will I had carried, in the truth I had revealed. David entered the room quietly, his hand resting on my shoulder. He did not need to speak. The weight of his presence was enough, his earlier words still echoing in the silence that followed. I leaned into him, Lily curled between us, the three of us bound together in a way no humiliation could break. I knew the road ahead would not be simple. Rachel would not forgive Eleanor, would not relent, and the scars of family betrayal do not fade overnight. But the balance had shifted. For once, the power of their silence was gone. The truth had found its voice, and it had been heard by everyone who mattered. My eyes returned to Lily's. She was drifting toward sleep, her lips curled in a faint smile. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, whispering that she was safe now. She murmured that she believed me, and those words steadied me more than anything else could. As I looked out once more at the city lights, the question rose in my chest, one I could not hold back. Justice may take time, but truth always finds its voice. And when the moment comes, when the choice is laid bare, will you stay silent, or will you stand and let the world hear you?